Katie here to do the interview because they were all involved in the tribunal that happened in Istanbul. And I know that Katie was very much deeply involved in that. In fact, you traveled there, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she went to Istanbul herself. So I could think of no better person to do this kind of conversation than Katie, along with, of course, two incredible people, Noura Erakat and Mokhiber. So I'm going to turn it over now to Katie Halper to lead us into this conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards for those of you that have time and want to stay. Over here, Layla. Yeah. And Albert, over here. We've been waiting for you to get started.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear me? I can either move this or I can hold. Yes. Is this on? Is this thing on? Yeah. Okay, that's easier. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. All right. Oh, hi. We have two Shalals here. Oh, three. Yeah. Where's Marjan? Is she here too? Okay, 4. All right, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. No feedback, right? Okay. I'm so honored to have been invited to speak here to moderate this conversation between two brilliant people. I will go. Ooh, okay. Well, anyone from New York City here? Do you want me to just like riff until you get it? Yeah, do a tight set. How many Mokhibers do we have in the crowd? 3? 3? Okay, nice. 4. Oh my gosh, wow. Oh my gosh, even more, wow. I don't think I have any helpers in this area. My parents used to live here. Oh, this is some trivia. Guess who my mom used to date, for real? A famous DC person. Yes, who got it? Marion Barry. Yeah. They met at a CORE meeting, Congress on Racial Equality. She was not involved later on in his life in any sordid ways. Any arrests. Yeah. Great. And do you have any peeps in the house? Any relatives where?
I have lots of friends, old friends, new friends, and of course the son of them.
Woo! Oh yeah.
Hik Ahsan?
Yes. I don't even know what you said, but I know the sound from here. What was that? What did you say? Oh, okay.
I have all the power. Look at that. That is, maybe I should moderate this, Katie.
Yeah, I know.
Like the voice
Well,
of
that would
God.
be interesting if you ask me questions about human rights law. I'll just kibitz. Yeah, he does, yeah.
Testing, 1, 2. That seems adequate.
Okay, great. Let me just have one water. Great. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our guests, although I will do an abbreviated introduction because they're both so prestigious that we'd be here all night if I gave all of their academic credits. So Noura Erakat is a professor of Africana Studies and Criminal Justice at Rutgers. She's also the author of Justice for Some, Palestine and the Law. Justice for Some, Law on the Question of Palestine. Okay, great. And I've read it. I just didn't remember the subtitle. Okay. It's a great book. Yeah. And she has some students here, former students, right, in the audience.
Shout out to my students.
Yeah.
Saman and Katandra. Katandra just finished law school.
And and I hope I'm not like spilling the beans, but apparently Noura was part of the reason you went. So there you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then we also have with us Mokhiber, who is a human rights lawyer, scholar, and was at the UN Commission on Human Rights until he resigned in protest of their failure to address the Gaza genocide, which you call the textbook genocide at the time. Yeah. And so the theme of tonight's show is Israel is holding Israel accountable. So it's about accountability, or in many cases, the lack thereof, right? So before we jump into more specific questions, I wanted to start with just the larger context, both the current and historical context of where the story of Israeli impunity begins and where we are today. And either of you can kick it off. Yeah.
I'll kick it off by saying that, one of the ways we've come to understand Israel's treatment in the international legal system is as an absolute exception. And while you can empirically demonstrate that exception, I also want to, share a little bit that the law actually functions to make that exception possible. So they're not acting, it's not an exception of lawlessness. It's an exception that asserts something that we call in law sui generis, unlike anything else, which insists that the fact pattern is so unique that there is no precedent and no analogy that can be applied, and therefore it justifies the creation of new law where no law exists to regulate the situation. Why do I say that? Because before the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the Palestine mandate that becomes part of the League of Nations mandate in 1922, where it becomes international law as preambular text, Palestinians were resisting even the suggestion that there would be any kind of Zionist settler sovereignty in a land where a native Palestinian people sought to govern themselves. And in their appeals to the British, who were the mandatory power, would insist this is a violation of Article 20 of the League of Nations mandate, that you cannot, create new policy that contravenes a pre-existing, right of a native people to become self-determined. Then they would say it's a violation of Article 22 of the League of Nations mandate, and so on and so forth. Very astute legal arguments, to which the British would respond and say, we understand that, but now there is an overriding duty, which is actually to establish, right? Not necessarily to establish a Jewish state. That wasn't the explicit policy of the British, but to establish a Jewish homeland, right? The creation of the state and the commitment to the state is a contingency as opposed to a plan by the British, as opposed to the Zionists, where it was always a plan. So here, what I want to emphasize is that it's not that they're acting out of lawlessness, but the British are saying, we understand this contravenes the law, but it's necessary to contravene the law in order to fulfill our legal obligations to fulfill the mandate of establishing a Jewish homeland. Herein lies the problem. Now we get this framework of sui generis, where Israel, or before Israel, Zionists are insisting, and Zionists to this day continue to insist, they are unlike anything else. There is no fact pattern. You cannot compare us to South Africa. You cannot compare us to another colony. You cannot apply human rights norms. You cannot apply the Fourth Geneva Convention, because the fact pattern is so unique to establish a Jewish homeland here on a land promised by God, and a very particular God. This isn't a universal God, right? So even then it's contravening this nature of international being universal that gives them that right. So where else do we see it? We see it first and foremost in the British mandate and the establishment of this commitment to establishing a Jewish homeland in the mandate era between the two world wars. We see it again very vividly in 1967, when Israel insists that its occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, is sui generis. It's not like any other occupation, because they're saying that there's no such thing as Palestinians, so there's no sovereign to return the land to. Therefore, unlike the Sinai and the Golan Heights, it's this missing revirginer argument, and therefore Israel will only apply occupation law as a matter of fact, but not law. It's sui generis. They tell us it's sui generis again during Oslo, when they don't apply any of the laws to 194, the prohibition on the annexation of Jerusalem, and so on and so forth, because they're saying that this is sui generis. We just want to achieve the peace process, which will be achieved politically. And for our purposes, most recently, they use sui generis to insist that Israel can use armed force in a territory that it occupies, where it absolutely cannot use that force. It has no right to self-defense in territory that it occupies. No occupying power does. This was made clear about the South Africans of apartheid. This was made clear about the Portuguese in Mozambique and Angola. This was made clear about Israel. They're not the first to make this argument, but they're saying that because of the Second Intifada, where the force and the resistance that they were facing was more than a civilian riot, right? But less than warfare, why are they doing that? Because if they recognize it as a civilian riot, they have to use law enforcement force and recognize that Palestinians are under their jurisdiction. They don't want to do that. That's explicit apartheid. But they don't want to recognize that Palestinians have the right to use armed force, which they absolutely do, against racist regimes, foreign occupation, and alien domination, right? Additional Protocol 1, Section 1, Subsection 4, blah, blah, blah. Because they don't think that Palestinians have the right, are a people and have the right to use force. So they say that this is an armed conflict short of war. They make it up where they can use military force against a civilian population that they say has no right to fight back. And then they tell us again in 2007 that it's sui generis because when they withdraw, 2005, when they withdraw from Gaza, when they say that Gaza is neither occupied nor is it independent. Gaza is a hostile entity. So notice what they're doing. They're not just making an exception. They are making a bid for new law, which they are applying. And we see that come most horrifically and atrociously in genocide, where they're making an exception for genocide using the sui generis framework and what I call Nakba peace. That in order to establish peace, they have to remove the Palestinians, which is why they justify targeting children. Because if they let the children live, they might have the audacity when they grow up to resist, as they have the right to, morally, legally, universally, to free themselves and their land. So this is a bit more complicated. I think when we say it's an exception, we're letting them off the hook because they're doing more than asking for the exception. They're creating new law, which then sets a precedent. And now they're saying that they're the most lawful, which is what they always say, that we're actually the most law-abiding, and this is why.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Noura. And I think that, the reason this is so dangerous is, first, because, as Noura points out, it creates a precedent where the same sort of, oppressive exceptions can then be extended to other situations as well. But it's not that there isn't law in place. It's not that genocide and torture and colonialism and all of these things are not prohibited by the existing framework of international law. They are. It's that very powerful forces, principally in the West, have decided from the very beginning that they would carve out this exception for this one regime that has come to be called Israel. And so in 1947, when the UN proposed the partition of Palestine against the will of the indigenous people, it was those people in the UN already knew in the General Assembly that that was in direct contradiction to existing international norms on self-determination, for example. And yet they institutionalized it with an official act of the United Nations against the will of the indigenous people. In 1948, when the UN recognized the state of Israel and in doing so ratified the ethnic cleansing and dispossession of the Palestinian people in Palestine, it was the same year that the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the same year that the UN adopted the Genocide Convention. And over and over and over again, all of the declared norms and standards of international law and of international diplomacy have been just pushed aside for this one oppressive foreign project in the heart of of Western Asia. And there was a moment in history, especially in the 1960s and 70s, when you saw a pushback that was very meaningful, when the majority of countries of the world, newly independent countries that had been colonized and had then become independent states in the United Nations, bound together and used the norms of international law to fight colonialism, to fight apartheid, to liberate peoples all around the world, and to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and to declare that peoples have a right to resist, including armed resistance, regimes that, foreign occupation, colonial domination, racist regimes like that in Israel. All of that was turned around again in favor of the Israel exception when Oslo came along, with the advent of the so-called unipolar world dominated by the government of the United States that has buildings around here somewhere, I think, and which they said, no, we're not going to apply international law to the Palestinian people. Why? Because the law is almost always on the side of the Palestinian people. If you read international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, laws on the use of force, the right to resist, all of that comes down on the side of the Palestinian people. You cannot enforce your exception for Israel and for the Zionist project unless you do operate outside of that legal framework. And so the main message that came out of the Oslo process was, do not talk to us about the rights of the Palestinian people under international law. They are going to have to negotiate for whatever rights they get with their oppressor. And the mediator is going to be the principal ally and arms supplier of their oppressor in the United States. So in other words, they found a way to make an exception, not just for Israel, but an exception for the Palestinian people, that of all the peoples in the world, human rights do not apply to them. They get what they negotiate for with the very forces that are oppressing them. Well, we saw that begin to turn around during the current wave of genocide over the course of the last 2 years plus, where the horror of the world and what they were witnessing, it's cliche, but it's true, the first live streamed genocide where people are seeing it unfold themselves, started to create a change. And there were rumblings in international law and international diplomacy that we had not seen before. There's the fact that Israel is now on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. There is the fact that Israel's leaders have been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. There is the fact that every major human rights organization around the world, every international human rights organization, Palestinian human rights organization, Israeli human rights organizations, have declared that Israel is perpetrating genocide and that it is an apartheid regime. And then you saw a movement in the General Assembly of the United Nations to harvest this all and to finally move on a track toward accountability. And that's when you saw this historic resolution in the General Assembly in September of 2024 that said, effectively codified what the International Court of Justice was saying, called the Israeli regime out and said, if you do not comply with all of this within 1 year, then there will be further consequences. Well, we'll talk more about this, but those consequences didn't come about because of what's been happening just in the last less than a year, in order, once again, to create an exception for the Israeli regime.
So, just two questions that I didn't plan for, but based on what you guys have been saying. So I'm a little confused, and I did not go to law school, so I did watch a lot of Law and Order, which I know is propaganda and problematic. But you said, you said that there is new law, that they've created new law. And you said that they act outside of the law. So when you say that they've created new law, do you mean through through which institutions and what kind of law? Like Israeli law, international human rights law, and also what's the difference between international human rights law and international humanitarian law? So,
This I think you're that's very precise, because you're hitting a tension. One is saying they're acting outside the law, and I'm saying they're actually making a legal argument, right? So people ask all the time, but why? If you're really strong, might makes right, you don't need to. But think about this. When the Bush administration, which was torturing detainees in Guantanamo, right? They didn't. They were waterboarding people. We saw images of sexual torture, but insisted that it wasn't torture, but called it enhanced interrogation techniques. So notice that even empire wants legitimacy and is not going to admit to the illegality. They did the same thing in Iraq. They never said we're invading Iraq because we want to. They said they tried to, pull some poop out of their butt. I'm a mom, as
Officially.
you can tell.
That's a legal term for
Exactly.
anyone who doesn't.
That's poop is generous.
Okay? They tried to pull poop out of their butt to basically, make some argument about preemptive self-defense and customary norm of the Caroline Doctrine when it was very clear. This was an act of aggression. This was the use of force without justification. Israel's doing the same thing. It is creating new realms of law where it is battling. Law is a battlefield. Law, with all due respect, I don't think that the law says one thing or another. It's suggested, right? But the law means, otherwise we wouldn't need attorneys. We would need literate people to read the law. The reason we have attorneys is because it is contentious. They are battling over interpretation and application. They are appealing to a judge who's then also applying it, right? This is what scholar Duncan Kennedy calls the legal work, right? That's why I insist that law is power, but power is contingent and changes across time. Like at the height of Third World revolt, when the Third World, when it unified itself in the non-aligned movement, right? And now it has an automatic majority at the General Assembly, can create new law, including, the right to self-determination and the right for guerrillas to be soldiers and use force. And this is what Israel is doing. It is basically saying, of course we're abiding by the law. Here's our interpretation of it. And so I don't think they're acting, of course we think they're lawless, and that's the work we do. We have to insist they're lawless. I'm speaking to you as allies, right? I would never be on stage, frankly, almost with any Israeli, but let's say with an Israeli advocate of their position and be this nuanced with that person. I would just insist that they are lawless and rogue and violent because that's the work that we're doing. But I'm giving you the nuance to tell you what they're doing, why it is they can get away with so much. They're advancing these legal arguments that some are actually, buying. Now, sometimes they're doing it to cover up for themselves, and sometimes we can create enough willpower, like when the ICJ decides in July 2024 that Israel's presence in the West Bank and Gaza is unlawful, it gets adopted by the General Assembly, and now we see it translated into power. But this is what I mean.
Yeah, and I don't think those 2 points are inconsistent either. They are lawless, they are rogue, but the action that they're taking because of the power dynamics are eroding and changing the law. Law is not static. The lawmaking process is fluid. It's changing all the time, and particularly in international law, where powerful actors do have the problem. The amount of energy, diplomatic in other words, invested by the United States in the wake of 9/11 to try to erode the most clearly defined international human rights standards of law, those on the prohibition of torture, was enormous, and it began to have an effect because it affects practice. And international law is formed in part by the practice of states. And when you have states saying that, this enhanced interrogation is lawful, that practice increases by other states, and it becomes a part of the lawmaking practice. So just as you can see a trajectory of strengthening of international law to protect human rights over a 75, 80-year period, you can also see moments where it was being pulled in other directions. And the Israeli example is the most obvious example that I've ever seen of this, where justifications for the most clearly defined war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide are being generated and repeated over and over again, not just by those perpetrators, but by a myriad of complicit actors, including Western governments like that of the US and the UK and Canada and Germany, including Western media corporations, and I mean all of them in this country, ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, I don't know who else exists, all of them, the New York Times, the Washington Post, that has an impact. And if there isn't a counterforce that is stronger, either a unified pushback from the global south, which, by the way, we're not seeing. We're not seeing at this moment. That is being eroded by very corrupting forces, including that of the U.S. government, and I think heading us in a dangerous direction. But from unified action by states and by people who apartheid was supported by the United States government straight up through the 1980s in this country, and it was only because people demanded. They organized in their churches and in their mosques and their labor unions and their community groups and so on, and said this will not stand. That not only was apartheid, support for apartheid eroded, the resistance to apartheid victorious, and by the way, it didn't settle for some Bantustan two-state solution, blah, 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 blah. They insisted on their liberation, and that became the norm. So now apartheid in international law is defined as a crime against humanity, just as Nakba must be defined as a crime against humanity, and that's a part of our project of international law.
And then, is there a difference between international humanitarian law and international human rights law? Just because I've heard both terms.
That's international humanitarian law is the law that applies in armed conflict. International human rights law applies all the time, in all situations, including in armed conflict. But what the International Court of Justice will tell you is that the lex specialis, similar to the phrase that Noura used earlier, a legal term, is international humanitarian law. So that's the principal force, but it's just international humanitarian law are the rules of armed conflict, including human rights protections during armed conflict.
One way I like to, which is yours is more comprehensive, but one way I like to tell my students is human rights law applies in peacetime, humanitarian law applies in wartime. And the law and the rights that we have available to us during wartime are constricted. So think about how your rights were diminished in the aftermath of September 11th, as the United States said that for national security exigencies, you don't have the right to privacy in the same way, right? And so on.
And by the way, these are manipulated all the time. Like when you hear Trump administration officials claiming that they are at war with fishing boats in the Caribbean and then bombing them, that's not war. Even if they were, those would be war crimes, to be clear. But what we're talking about here is just cold-blooded murder. There is no war that would be recognized internationally. This is just assassination of people willy-nilly for, I don't know what, some domestic political purpose.
Now, when you guys talk about new law, are you saying that they are interpreting existing laws in a certain way, or are you actually saying like there are new laws that are being created?
Okay, I'm going to give you an example. I open this can of worms. Let me give you an example. They're not drafting new law. You know why they can't draft new law? They can't get support for it. Okay? Israel is weak. As much power as we see them have militarily, all right, they are politically and militarily not even. I mean, given they acted without red lines and couldn't extract their hostages and captives militarily. I mean, that's so I say when they're strong militarily, thinking about the fact that they are the only they're the only nuclear power in the Middle East. I just want to be precise here, right? But they do not have the support politically to be able to create new law. The way that they do it is through custom. So international law is based both on treaties, which are an international contract where all states have to agree to it, and custom, which is what states do and what they believe is legal. When a state, and all states are obligated to it, when a state violates customary law consistently, they can also be making a bid for new law. So they are creating new law, but in customary law. How did they do this? For example, here's an example. At the start of the Second Intifada, Israel, for the first time, made its assassination campaign public. Before, it was assassinating Palestinian political leaders quietly, right, covertly. But during the Second Intifada, they literally took warplanes and were striking Ramallah, right? And assassinating and striking Gaza. They assassinated political and military leaders of Hamas and Fatah. Completely illegal. Like, this disrupted everything. And the United States, the Bush administration actually responds and says, you can't use lethal force in this territory. If there's a wanted person, you're an occupying power, you capture them and put them on trial, right? But it's because it's an extrajudicial assassination. But Israel was making this argument, we are facing an armed conflict short of war. This isn't an extrajudicial assassination. This is a targeted killing. Are you familiar with that word? You might be, because who made it famous? The United States made it famous. Despite the US's initial opposition to extrajudicial assassinations by Israel, when the Twin Towers were hit, the Bush administration picked up the policy of extrajudicial assassinations and now started to normalize it. Now you have two of the most significant military powers in the world using this and arguing that it's not a violation. They're making a bid for new customary law. And by the time the Obama administration, they were getting opposition. So long as there's opposition, it's not law. But when the Obama administration comes into power, he uses drone strikes to even assassinate US citizens, okay? Like Anwar al-Awlaqi in the Yemen, the Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. And now, because Obama is a liberal darling, right? And uses this policy manifold more times than the Bush administration does, right? Now there's no opposition globally. Now they're saying, oh, this is much less messy than a full-on war. And so what was illegal and called extrajudicial assassinations, today they call targeted killings. And so this is the custom. It's not that it's legal, but it's controversial enough that you see other countries actually using it, including President Duterte of the Philippines, who starts assassinating anyone he declares a drug lord. Similar to the assassination of fishermen in the Caribbean, right? So this is where we can say it's not law, but this is the bid for new law and how they're doing it. Okay, I think we're good.
Yes, that was very clear. Thank you. Now I understand. Okay.
Let me just give one small addition to that as well. Where you can see this play out the most is in the International Court of Justice case of genocide against the Israeli regime. Listen to the opening arguments and the initial documents in that case, and you see South Africa says, Israeli leaders have declared genocidal intent, one of the requirements of genocide, and they are carrying out genocidal acts. And then they list a long litany of genocidal acts being perpetrated by the Israeli regime. Israel's response was almost entirely a non-legal response. It was, any judge would say, this is irrelevant, stop saying this, because they didn't have a legal defense. What they said was, Hamas was mean to us. Well, that's not a defense, you know. What they said was that, you know, we have a right to defend ourselves. Well, that doesn't give you a right to perpetrate acts of genocide. And, you know, over and over again, they raised, you know, the specter of the Holocaust, which, you know, newsflash, Hamas had nothing to do with. So what they do is that they know in that conversation that they are not convincing the judges of the International Criminal Court, but they're not speaking to the judges of the International Criminal Court. They're speaking to Western journalists and Western politicians and Western public to try to maintain the exception that says, whatever the law says, we are Israel, it doesn't apply to us.
Yeah, I mean, a great disgusting example perhaps of that is when the United Nations ambassador walked in with his crew wearing Stars of David, right? Like, that was how they responded to being called out for crimes, is just pretending that they're somehow right now the victims of this. I mean, it was like so disgusting and such a desecration. But so let's talk more about, well, actually, let's get into something specific, which is Security Council Resolution 2803, 2802. Yeah, right? 2803. Okay. 2803, yeah. What is it, and why has there been such a backlash to it?
It's an atrocity. It is I worked at the UN for 32 years. I followed the UN for years before that. I continue to follow the UN. And what I have written is that it is the biggest betrayal of the Palestinian people, of international law, of common decency, since the UN purported to partition Palestine against the will of the indigenous people. But it's even more offensive than that. This process that we were talking about, where you have the ICJ and the ICC and then the General Assembly resolution all moving toward accountability for the Israeli regime, was just about to reach its deadline when we saw a scurrying of Israel's friends, the French and the Saudis on one side and the United States on the other side, coming up with new proposals to avoid Israeli accountability and to normalize the regime in the middle of a genocide for which it was being called out. And the French and the Saudis came up with this bizarre colonial plan that was declared in the New York Declaration that is, let's say, a more polite version than the Trump plan. And then Trump came along with his very vulgar Trumpian plan, which is not even 19th century colonialism. I've said it's King Leopold-esque. King Leopold of Belgium owned the Congo as his personal property and carried out genocide in the Congo for his own personal profit. That's what 2803 does. It makes the people of Gaza the subjects of Donald Trump, not even of the United States, because annexed to the resolution is Trump's plan, which says very specifically, he is the head of the colonial administration that they call the Board of Peace. He is the head of the proxy occupation force that they call the International Stabilization Force. He controls the money that comes in. He controls the movement of people. He controls any reconstruction. He controls the rights of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And he does so explicitly in this resolution in consultation with the Israeli regime, the principal perpetrators of the genocide. And a resolution adopted in the midst of a genocide makes no mention of the genocide. It makes no mention of accountability for the perpetrators. It makes no mention of redress for the victims. It makes no mention of apartheid or colonization. It even says, in clear violation of international law and of all of the findings of the International Court of Justice, that the Israeli occupation can continue indefinitely under the terms of the resolution, whereas the International Court of Justice gave them 1 year to end it last year. Now this resolution says it can continue indefinitely, and then they superimpose on top of it another layer of occupation, which is the U.S. occupation, all to the benefit of the Israelis. It wants to disarm the victims of the genocide, but not the perpetrators. It wants to punish the victims of the victims of the genocide, but not the perpetrator. It's normalizing the perpetrator regime and further punishing the victims of and survivors of the genocide. It is the single most vulgar act of any international organization, certainly of the United Nations. And now they've passed it. I got to say one more thing about this, because I published last week another piece on this in which I laid out the case that this resolution is unlawful. And I began by quoting Richard Nixon in his famous interview with David Frost, where Frost asked him, can the president of the United States do something that's illegal? And Nixon's answer, now infamous, was, if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, what people are doing now with the Security Council resolution, which is a clear violation, not just of international law, but of international law breaches that have just been identified by the International Court of Justice explicitly with regard to the situation in Palestine. People are saying, well, the Security Council has adopted this resolution, so now it's lawful, to Noura's point. No, it's not lawful. It is unlawful. It is ultra vires. The Security Council does not have the legal right to operate outside the bounds of what the UN Charter gives it. It does not operate outside international law. It is a mechanism within international law. And so what I'm telling people, this resolution must be opposed, resisted. Governments must be pressured not to participate in any way in this. We need to find ways to overturn it. We need to get around the Security Council, which has become a part of the problem. For 2 years, it couldn't become a part of the solution by calling for a single ceasefire. But as soon as a veto could have saved the rights of the Palestinian people, there was no veto to be found. The Security Council has gone rogue, and if you think that's dangerous for Palestine, you're right, but guess what? That's a very dangerous precedent for the rest of the world as well.
I just want to add a couple of things based on, I could not emphasize enough Craig's point about the illegality of this, that there's no mention of Palestinian self-determination, right? Hamas has offered amnesty and told to demilitarize, and yet Palestinians have the right to use force, and there should be accountability for the perpetrators of genocide. The fact that there's no timetable for withdrawal, there's not even a place, a boundary to where they're going to withdraw to. So if the green line, which is a false partition, wasn't enough, now we have a new yellow line. And Palestinians are forced to do some sort of loyalty tests that they oppose Hamas in order to be fed and housed. I mean, this is where, but the things I want to add, a couple of things. One, I totally agree that it was atrocious that there wasn't a veto. But what I think is more atrocious is the fact that the PA supported this resolution. I think that that has actually been the most atrocious point. And so the PA support, no, you can get into it. The fact that we know that because they were under Saudi, Qatari, and Emirati pressure. There is Gulf money here and a vision to recreate Western Asia, right? And the PA wants to be on that train. The same way that they were the ones who entered Oslo, knowing full well it was a trap, right? And so they're doing it again in this moment, which is why you see of the 15 members of the Security Council, Algeria, which has been the most vocal in the past 2 years, voted yes for the resolution. And the Russians and the Chinese couldn't vote no, couldn't veto a resolution that the Palestinians said they supported. So I just want to say that we have agency through and through. This is not just something happening to us, but this is also the Palestinians who have been co-opted doing it to our own body. The other point I want to make is that the moment that this comes, the moment that 2803 comes, is precisely, it's because we don't get, like Craig mentioned, 6 ceasefire resolutions are vetoed by the US systematically, 4 under the Biden administration. Right? Just lest we forget, this is a bipartisan issue for US government. They gut the authority of the Security Council and then impose this basically colonial plan, right? But they do it at a time, not because Palestinians had suffered enough, okay? They do it because they're saving Israel. Israel was bleeding out. Israel was Netanyahu couldn't get an audience in the General Assembly. There were mass general strikes in Italy and inklings of them in Spain, right? The EU was discussing comprehensive sanctions. Israel was bleeding out. This was a moment to save Israel on Israeli and US terms. And what they're doing yet again is normalizing the idea of Zionism, normalizing that an ethno-state that is comprised of a Jewish demographic majority that requires the constant removal of Palestinians and the theft of their land is somehow normal. This is not the first time. They normalized the apartheid reports. Remember when the apartheid reports came out by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International 2020, 2021? We could have dismantled apartheid, but the US goes full force with the Abraham Accords to normalize apartheid. In Oslo, it was another moment where we were confronting the contradiction of Zionism and a Jewish demographic majority state. And there too, Oslo saved Israel and gave it another lifeline by now making it a peace process, and you couldn't critique Israel because you were undermining, you weren't being a good peace partner, right? This is yet another attempt to give Zionism another lifeline. And like I was telling my sister, Noura Burqan, right? Our work right now is to make this impossible. We can't just, the EU immediately stopped its efforts to impose sanctions on Israel. We have to ramp it up. These states want nothing more than to go back to a normal where Palestinians suffer and die quietly. The UN had said that Gaza was going to be unlivable in 2012. They told us, due to a lack of hygiene and food and clean water. 2020 came. They said it would happen by 2020. 2020 came, 2021 came, 2022 came. Almost 2023 ended. And the world was okay with Palestinians suffering and dying quietly. And now 2803, aside from its illegality, is that lifeline to make us somehow more okay with this so that we go back to that normal. But the situation now for Palestinians on the ground is actually worse than it was on October 6, 2023. This is the time when everything should be ramped up. And so the scariest thing, as far as I'm concerned, aside from the illegality, is really the trying to normalize Zionism yet again when we know that it's basically at the end of its life. It's at the end of its life. And we have to make that more clear than ever in an environment where that's more risky than ever.
You know, Noura, you're reminding me, just a couple of days ago, I heard the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, in an interview. And I think people know how infuriated I have been with his conduct during this genocide. But this really underscored how institutionalized this idea that Noura is talking about has become, because he said there are only two possibilities. So in his brain, there are only two possibilities. One is a one-state solution where the Palestinians are second-class citizens in an Israeli state. And the other is a two-state solution where each state gets to live the way that they want to live. Well, I mean, we can talk about the possibility of a so-called two-state solution and the Bantustans that represents. But what that showed is that for Antonio Guterres, he cannot imagine a solution without Zionism. He cannot imagine a solution without a supremacist, ethno-supremacist regime ruling over at least most of historic Palestine. And everything that happens in the diplomatic process is operating inside that box. And that, the reason you see the level of complicity, including from the Palestinian Authority, I'm sorry, they are complicit in this. The reason so many states, as Noura points out, they went to ask, what should we do? And they were told by the Palestinian Authority, support this resolution. And then they went to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians said, support this resolution. And the Saudis, and the Emiratis, and the entire Arab group. And then they were told, if you don't support this resolution, they were told by the Americans, the U.S. ambassador, effectively, we will unleash the dogs of genocide. We will allow the Israelis, with our full support, to continue the genocide. And by the way, Saudi Arabia, you want advanced fighter jets, and you want a special security agreement of a non-NATO ally with the United States, and so you will become a cheerleader for this process. And by the way, Egypt, the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, whose job it is to protect the southern border of the Israeli regime, you have to support this as well. And by the way, developing country who is looking for aid and doesn't want these tariffs. I was told by diplomats in New York that it was the most brutal diplomatic assault in the U.S. I've said this before, but it's true. I can tell you after many years in international affairs, they don't usually have the very best diplomats because they don't need to be good diplomats. They have power. They have carrots and sticks. And they deployed those around this resolution in an unprecedented way to get an outcome that I have said permanently discredits the Security Council and leaves a permanent stain on the broader United Nations. And either that will be undone by some of the measures that we've been talking about, or I'm not sure that they will recover. But the Palestinian cause will survive because, yes, the PA supported this plan, but it was rejected by all of Palestinian civil society, all of the political factions except that of the PA, that piece of Fatah, and all the resistance groups. So Palestine rejected this plan, and the PA doesn't speak for the Palestinian people. And
so, Craig, you recently discussed ways to overcome the challenge posed by the Security Council resolution and using available mechanisms available to the General Assembly and drawing on the UN Charter itself. Can you discuss these mechanisms?
Well, I mean, my principal argument is that if there isn't a counterbalance coming from people in all of the capitals of the world to force their governments to push back on this, we will not succeed. States operate for, surprise, surprise, they are not altruistic entities. And so we need to mobilize that pressure to get member states, one, to refuse to in any way participate in this, and two, to take measures to oppose it. What measures could they take to oppose it? They could continue to support the movement for Palestinian freedom through boycott and divestment and sanction and military embargoes. All of us through mass demonstrations, through general strikes, through direct action, through civil disobedience, through legal action against Israeli perpetrators in domestic courts and in international courts. All of those sort of things that we know are so important to the solidarity movement and to the struggle in Palestine. Those become important also to focus on this particular, this thing cannot be allowed to stand. It cannot allowed to be implemented. And already we're seeing it come unraveled because it was nonsense from the beginning. You don't have all these countries rushing to volunteer troops to defend the Israeli regime and attack the Palestinian resistance. And you're not going to see a rush of volunteers for that. But we need to really keep up the pressure. We could press member states, not ours, because the United States, we talk about complicity, the United States is the co-perpetrator of the genocide in Palestine. It's not just complicit. It couldn't go on for a day without the United States. It is the enthusiastic co-perpetrator under Democratic and Republican administrations in the resolution. We can push other member states, though, to take action in the UN General Assembly. We talk about uniting for peace, which is a way to get around the veto in the Security Council with a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. They could deploy protection to Palestine. They could reactivate the anti-apartheid mechanisms to go after the Israeli regime. They could establish a tribunal to hold Israeli perpetrators accountable. They could adopt sanctions and a military embargo. Yes, they could not enforce them the way the Council can, but they can get all the countries to come on board. They can report on them. They can expand them. They can begin to chip away at this wall of Israeli impunity and at this atrocious resolution and return to a steady progression toward accountability for the Israeli regime and justice for the Palestinians.
The only thing I want to emphasize here is, right, the point I'm hearing from you, Craig, that I want to emphasize as well is that this is good and bad, this news that I have for us. But it's that no one is going to save us. These states are not going to do what we need them to do. That's the good news and the bad news. It's bad because obviously we need them to do it and we need them to mobilize. But it's good because that means we have agency. It's on us, right? But I don't think that this work is going to come in the UN. I think that the work is going to come outside in the work that we do. As much as we might feel powerless against these powers and what they're planning in the Eastern Mediterranean gas fields and the coalition between Egypt, Israel, and the PA to extract that, oil and so on, we are powerful in our institutions. We are powerful in our communities. We are powerful in our places of worship. We are powerful in our unions, right? Everywhere we are, we can exercise agency. And that's actually what we need to be emphasizing. It's how we shift the culture to make sure that our institutions, wherever we have agency, speaks for us. The worst thing we can do is to look at the writing on the wall and to say, game over. We've lost this, right? That's the worst thing we can do because then we're losing sight of how powerful we actually are. When we can actually chase down, even if we can't, in the US, there's a lot of laws that would prohibit you from actually suing dual nationals like Charles Raab from Chicago, Daniel Raab from Chicago, the US Israeli dual national who shot a Palestinian young boy dead. And then when his brother tried to retrieve his corpse, shot his brother, and then says on camera, I don't know what's so important about that corpse. Just the ease, right, with which they hunt Palestinian children. He's in Chicago. Well, there's laws that would make it really impossible in US courts, and I can tell you about them, but it's just, why? We talked enough about the law. That would make it, to sue him under the War Crimes Act. But that doesn't stop people in Chicago from making it known to everybody and everywhere that he goes that he is a war criminal. That doesn't make it impossible for us to make it known where he's actually, wherever he works, that you've hired a war criminal. even if the law is not going to do what we want it to do, we have the agency to insist on the outcomes that we want. There must be accountability. And so we can do that. All right? So that's the point that I want to emphasize. And I want to emphasize something else. That in my moment of seeing, before 2803 was done, even when I saw the 20-point plan, and my heart sank, like, are you serious? This is the twilight zone. This is not how you end a genocide, by punishing its survivors, right? We need tribunals. We need reparations. We need, rebuilding projects. We need to rehabilitate. But one of the things I heard from a friend from Gaza is that, the message to me was Palestinians have had the most powerful countries, imperial powers, collude against them for over a century. They got this. All they need is time to sleep and to eat. And so that reminds me, one, that the locus of power remains in Palestine, number one. And that number two, if Palestinians are not surrendering, there is no universe where we can surrender.
So November was significant. November was significant not just because November 2025. Yeah. Significant not just because the Resolution 2803 was passed then, but it's also the month that marks the 50-year anniversary of UNGA Resolution 3379, condemning Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. Noura, you've written about the drafting history of this resolution and its contemporary significance in this moment. Can you comment on this a little?
I think we touched on a little bit. Do y'all know about this Resolution 3379? Well, I know my old heads do, because they were there when this happened. One of our greatest legal Palestinian ancestors is Fayez Sayegh, who was exiled from Tabariya, goes on to study at AUB, becomes a jurist, and then a lead debater that nobody would debate him because he was so powerful, and was the lead and was one of the directors of the Palestine Research Center, and publishes in 1965 the pamphlet Zionist Colonialism of Palestine, where he offers us the first racial colonial theory of Zionism, right? So in 1975, at the height of Third World Revolt, when there was an automatic majority at the General Assembly, Palestinians, he does this. He's working for the Kuwaiti delegation because he can't represent Palestine. But they basically amend a resolution. There was a resolution that wanted to condemn apartheid in South Africa and isolate the apartheid regime. Well, the Palestinians, with their allies, amend that resolution to insert the word Zionism everywhere. That resolution condemns colonialism, alien domination, apartheid, and then they added Zionism. It was a hard-fought battle in 1975. Takes a long time. It's a really interesting history, but it passes. It passes by something like 72 to 35. And in that moment, we have Zionism on its own as being a form of racism and racial discrimination. And had the Palestinians run with that to do what South Africans did and Africans in general did, which was to make apartheid a crime against humanity in 73 through its own treaty, we would have had Zionism in a treaty as a crime against humanity. But instead, the PLO, to enter Oslo, rescind the resolution as a precondition for entering Oslo. Shame. Shame. Why? Because they say, how are you going to condemn Zionism and be a good partner for peace? And so they rescind it. Anyway, not to be, but the point is here, this November 10th, 2025 was the 50th anniversary of that resolution. And what was so remarkable about that moment is that literally 7 days later is when they passed 2803. And what's so remarkable about that moment is that this should be the time that we're insisting Zionism is racism and a form of racial discrimination. It is an illegitimate ideology. It is an illegitimate ideology that premises on genocidal expansion and territorial consolidation. They say it explicitly. And we need to normalize that language, right? And that was the missed opportunity. Now, that said, the reason that it might be a little bit harder in this moment is precisely because of the Palestinian complicity. But it doesn't make it impossible for us to study that history, to have that language. One of the major frustrations that I've faced with young Palestinians, and I am so empathetic for all young Palestinians who have come into political maturation in this moment, which is so atrocious, right? They're so frustrated. Why are we using apartheid? Why are we using, apartheid, for them, they think apartheid is about civil rights and integration, when it's not. Apartheid is a form of colonization. And in fact, the ANC, I think, missed their opportunity because they didn't demand land redistribution. They agreed to democratizing the settler colony, right? But one of the things I tell these young Palestinians is if we actually have our own language, we don't need any analogies to make our case. We don't need apartheid and genocide because we can literally just say Zionism and Nakba. We have our own language. And that's the work. And I think, Craig, if you want to comment a little bit more on that, I know Rabia Ghbariya, and you said it earlier, the work of making Nakba also more legible in these international frameworks in a time when everybody is trying to normalize the Nakba as well, including that French-Saudi declaration, which wanted to establish a Palestinian state. Any move in that direction is also normalizing Nakba.
I think you said it. What you mean on the development of Nakba as illegal? No, I think you said it very well, and I think it's a very compelling argument because it's a very. It is true that the crime of genocide, as defined, has been perpetrated on the Palestinian people, and not just for the last 2 years. This goes all the way back to the original Nakba. It is true that the crime of apartheid, a crime against humanity, is being perpetrated by the Palestinian people, and not just 1967, but going all the way back to 1948. But there are particularities because of this exception that Noura and I spoke about. That's been carved out for Israel to the Palestinian experience, and Nakba is a crime in its own right. And these interesting moves to try to have it codified as such, I think, are important. Just as the move to codify colonialism as a crime against humanity that's now beginning to, be revisited again, which I think is a very important development as well. This is the lawmaking process that we talked about, law being fluid. It's not only influenced by the negative actions of lawless regimes like that based here in Washington or that in Tel Aviv. It's also influenced by mobilizations of people and peoples and coalitions of states that have common interests, like the formerly colonized states, and those in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So I think there is a very good argument for following both tracks, for demanding accountability for genocide and apartheid and all of that, while still pursuing the particularities of Nakba and demanding accountability for that as well. There is no what the institutions and the powers that be have been trying to do is to find a solution that preserves this supremacist ideology and the privileging of a colonial presence on historic Palestine. So every solution they look for, they begin with that as a given. This must be preserved and protected, usually expanded as well. And you're never going to get to a resolution of this question from a human rights or a justice perspective if that is your objective. It should be the objective that we demand for everyone else, equal human rights, right? I mean, it's a very, very simple formula, and it's not going to be resolved in that way. Even if you were to get, first of all, the two-state solution they're offering is a strong state of Israel and a Palestinian Bantustan or Bantustans in a non-viable setting. There's nothing left of Palestine for a viable Palestinian state if you are preserving Zionist supremacy and a Zionist entity on the land. And even if you did, it would not resolve the human rights of two other groups of Palestinians, those who live inside the Green Line, who you are relegating to permanent second-class status, third, fourth, fifth-class status in Palestine, and the millions of Palestinians in the diaspora who have a right to return, who have a right to their property, who have a right to compensation, who have a right to realize their human rights and to be a part of the polity on that land, which was their land. So the reason that they tie themselves in knots in diplomatic discussions in the UN is not because it's hard to find a solution that would bring about human rights and peace and justice and all of that. It's because they can't do that and preserve the central project of the Israeli state and of the Zionist ideology. We have to get past that. We just have to say, surprise, surprise, Palestinians are human beings. They're entitled to human rights, and there is no exception for Palestine and Israel.
So we have a hard out at 7, right, Andy? I know. Yeah. So I am going to do like a kind of lightning round, optional lightning round, where you guys get to choose.
Lightning round with me and Noura. Good luck.
I know, seriously. Yeah. I know. I should have. All right. I'm going to give you guys option. It's not really a lightning round. It's like elimination lightning round. So, both. Yeah. So hopefully quickly, but also you get to pick them. So here are the options for what to talk about. Okay. Here are the options. Oh yeah, you want by applause. Yeah, seriously. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right, yeah, I'll do all the questions, then we'll go back with applause. Okay. So the optional questions are talking about the Gaza tribunal that you guys organized, that I actually was at in Istanbul. Another option is the what about Sudan talking point that Boris loved using, and what the actual connection is between the genocide of in Gaza and Sudan. Another one is speaking of intersections between different countries, the imperial boomerang. Another question is, how are Israel and its allies trying to shore up impunity right now for Israel? What is the path to accountability? What can we do to bring that about? So which one? So I'm going to do it again. Ready? And people can clap. You guys can probably also combine some of these. There is, yeah. Right, but sorry, that was my segue into that. Okay, I'll see. All right, yes. So, all right, here they are. Ready? Talk about the value of a popular tribunal and what we can hope to see from it. That's one question. How do we read the genocides in Sudan and Gaza side by side? Please talk about the imperial boomerang. What are Israel and its allies doing to try to shore up impunity? Yeah, I think that's enough. Yeah. And what is the path to justice and accountability? Okay. All right. So obviously we'll do that one. Do you want to do any of the other ones? Yeah, Sudan. Sure. Okay. Sudan and then path. And then open,
Definitely. That question is the most important one. And I think folks are here because they want to hear about that. And there we can also talk about the tribunal, which is also part of the pathway to accountability. And let's emphasize that. The reason, I want to raise up Sudan is because I think that we must, right? And I don't think that Sudan is a distraction. I think that understanding Sudan is like central to what's happening, and that our genocide can't just be important in one place, ending it in one place. It exists in both. This also matters a lot because so much of the attention, obviously, on Palestine has less to do with Palestinians and has everything to do with our adversary and being obsessed with Israel, right? But at the same time, there's also very racist tropes that are making Sudan less significant for us, including this, concept of violence in the African continent and black-on-black violence and so on. And I think we need to disrupt that as well. So in part, that's why, why is it important then to read Sudan and Gaza together? Because these are part of the same region, and there's very similar forces that are at play in both of them, right? And those forces have to do specifically, when you look at the Gaza reconstruction plan and what's at stake, it's this idea of being able to take over Gaza, to have access to its gas, to rebuild it where it becomes an economic free trade zone that's basically available to others in a way that and this is the fantasy of the deal of the century or the apartheid plan that Trump introduced the first time. This is Jared Kushner's vision of seeing that the most optimal model for Palestinians is to be something of the sort like what you see in Dubai or Hong Kong or Singapore, where there isn't necessarily political democracy, but there's some sort of economic democracy that those who live in those areas can benefit from, right? That's really scary. But in the Sudan, there's a very similar interest. Sudan is not just a site of a significant amount of gold, right, that's being laundered in the Emirates, but in the way that it's extracted is illegal. But Sudan is also, across the entire Western Asian region, the site of 45% of all arable land. To survive, the region will need to rely on the land in Sudan. And Sudan, between 2004 and 2013, literally sold off something like, a significant amount of its arable land to private investors, making it the second most significant site of foreign direct investment after Saudi Arabia. So we're getting this story on the top level of violence and conflict and what have you, but really there's also a plan to privatize these lands against the will in a way that will actually trump the will of its people and national sovereignty. They're looting. They're looting Gaza. They're looting the Sudan. And the Emirates are directly involved in the Sudan in the way that the United States is involved in Israel. It's a co-conspirator. It is backing the Rapid Support Forces, which is committing a genocide against the Masalit ethnic tribe in the Darfur region. And what's so here when we think about accountability for these two situations, one, I just think we just need to raise them to hold them together, right? But the other is, no, there's this contradiction where Palestine actually gets a provisional measure at the ICJ that finds a plausible genocide in Gaza, right? But when the Sudanese try to do that and take the UAE to the ICJ dismisses the case. Shame. Shame. There's a legal argument. I'm going to spare you it. I find that boring, but I'm happy to explain it in the Q&A. Now, why is that important? Because in the Palestine case, you get an ICJ ruling, but then you get the US and everybody else ignoring the ICJ ruling. In the Sudan case, you get the case dismissed, but the US, under the Biden administration, recognized the genocide in the Sudan and imposed sanctions on Hamati, the leader of the RSF, as well as on the RSF itself for where it was getting its weapons. So notice the incongruency that you can get the legal outcome without the political outcome you want. In another case, you're getting the political outcome without the legal outcome. So helping us, and I think that's a good segue for us to think about when we think about accountability, the over-reliance on law is a losing strategy. All right? That is a tactic. We must use it everywhere we can, and we are, but that is not going to save us, right? And so look at this contradiction in this case and how it's happening. And especially the other contradiction is that when the Biden administration was pressed, how can you find that there is a genocide in the Sudan? Why can't you apply that outcome in Gaza? They deter and tell you, oh, the two-state solution. But there is a way to recognize genocide without that ICJ decision. And that propels us. I'm saying this both to raise up Sudan as a point, but also to propel us to think about accountability.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I would also say that when you look at a place that you presume the conflicts are internal, you have to zoom out and see which arms from outside are reaching into that place, both historically. So, the British have something very much in common in Sudan and in Palestine, which is their colonial meddling that privileged some groups and punished others, that then continued into the future. That's true in the division of tribes in Sudan as well, historically. It's true as well of the United States that forced Sudan to sign an Abraham Accord in 2023 to privilege Israel, or it would not remove its state sponsor of terror designation. It wasn't implemented because then the genocide picked up in Palestine, but they were forced to do that. And guess what? Israel has a presence in the Sudan. Reports are coming out all through these horrific atrocities of Israeli weapons, of Israeli surveillance technology, of Israeli tactics being used by the RSF in particular, where they will commit atrocities and then offer a legal justification. So that refugee camp was being used as a military outpost. Those medics were actually a part of the military resistance. You know, the Israeli playbook being very much applied to Noura's point about about precedent becoming practice here as well. And then the concept of mediation. I mean, there is no more absurd concept in international diplomacy than the idea that the United States is the mediator in Palestine. The United States is the co-perpetrator in Palestine. Nowhere else in the world do they say, yes, you can be a co-perpetrator and you can be the mediator. And so it is in Sudan. You know, they have set up something diplomatically called the Quad that includes the United States, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi, all of which are implicated in one way or another in the conflict that's taken there. And a fifth state has been very assertively offering itself as a mediator, and that fifth state is Israel. As ironic as that may sound, very concerned, of course, about the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, and trying to block the shipping of weapons to resistance groups that are fighting against Israeli aggression and Israeli. And then the final thing, I mean, on Noura's point on arable land, that arable land is shrinking. And it is on the margins of the desertification because of climate change in that country and the shrinking arable land that the original conflicts that happened 20 years ago in Darfur that we all heard so much about with the Janjaweed, who, by the way, became the RSF, effectively, it was originally conflicts between herders, so one group of tribes, and farmers, represented by other tribes, that then saw the Sudanese government investing in one side over the other, privileging them, arming them, providing them air support, and so on. So there is a deeply racist tendency in Western reporting in particular to try to see violence somewhere and say, what is wrong with those people? We see it in Palestine all the time, the arrogance of reporters who say, it's been going on there forever, those people, you know how they are, even as our own government is a principal instigator and villain in all of that. And so it is across Africa and countries of the global south. You cannot separate these. And this is why I think, for all of its flaws, international human rights, international law are important. They provide a set of standards that you can use to determine the legitimacy of claims. And otherwise, it's just politics, and politics of this kind is just bad news.
I want to add a plug to my favorite Mamdani on this question. Senior Mahmoud Mamdani, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who wrote of Saviors and Survivors, where he really does scrutinize this question about the history of Darfur, and also goes on to scrutinize the application of why they find genocide in the Darfur but not in Iraq, right? So really critical work. The other Mamdani.
And then path forward / audience questions. How do you want to do this? Do you want to do the path forward now and then open it up? Okay. Okay. So, yes. Audience questions. And please, no comments. You can do comments after. Sorry. I can't stand that. Yeah. No name dropping. Yeah, unless it saves time, but yeah.
Okay. We're going to go around and allow a couple of people to ask questions. I want to ask the first one, if you don't mind. One of the happiest days of my life was when the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. And yes. And the second happiest was when Mamdani won the New York mayorship and said that he would arrest Netanyahu. So I want to ask you, under what legal precedence can he do that? Can he do that as the mayor of a local city? And what would that look like?
Netanyahu's coming to town soon, right?
It would look very joyful.
Yeah,
Sure. Should we do that really quick? So I'm not going to do it here, but I do have a scathing critique of the ICC and their arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant. I'm going to spare you that, okay? I'm going to spare you that, but this is because international law is a site of domination. And to the extent that we use it in order to, for emancipatory purposes, we're basically being like guerrillas, like the same way guerrillas in war are turning they don't have weapons, but they're turning their enemies' strengths into weaknesses, and they're turning their weaknesses into strengths. So we're being like guerrilla lawyers, okay? Even though the ICC is biased against the Palestinians. And I have a book coming out where you can read more about that with my Irish compa, John Reynolds. I still think it was also a happy day. Why? Because Hamas was already being punished. There's more charges against more Hamas leaders. They even charge Hamas with extermination, which is basically genocide without intent. And they don't charge, and with sexual assault, and they don't charge Netanyahu and Gallant with either extermination or sexual assault. They're charging them with starvation, okay? But notwithstanding this imbalance and injustice, okay, it's still amazing that it happens because Hamas is already sanctioned. It's already sanctioned. It already doesn't have the international standing. It doesn't have people loving them and then they're falling from grace. Where in contrast, this is a shock. This was breaking a major taboo of not only going after Israel, which felt that it was always going to have impunity and enjoy impunity, but it also disrupted the farce that those who pay attention know, which is that the ICC, since it was established, basically only went after African and Arab heads of state. These are the first Western leaders they've actually indicted. That's why the US is going nuts and has sanctioned the ICC. Karim Khan, 6 judges, Francesca Albanese, Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. And Senator Lindsey Graham can run his mouth and say the ICC was never set up to go after us. Right? So it's still a victory, notwithstanding that critical approach. That's the nuance and why we can still use it. What about Mamdani arresting Netanyahu? He can totally arrest Netanyahu. He can do it under the color of law. I mean, the U.S. will probably intervene, and it can use, federal power in order to apply some sort of an exception. But that doesn't mean that, that domestic law enforcement, which is under the control of the New York State and then the city of New York, wouldn't have to abide by those sovereign orders to arrest him.
I'm going to go there, then back here.
Craig, I want to thank you for your efforts to try to get a protection force instead of a stabilization force. But now that there is this, at least on the books, the call for a stabilization force, should we be pushing that countries don't supply any troops, even though there are some Palestinians I've heard that said that the presence of foreign troops could be could help lessen Israel's violations or at least expose them more?
Yeah, I think that states should refuse to participate in any way with this scheme that is not designed to protect the rights of the Palestinian people and will not mobilize troops that will provide protection for the Palestinian people. If you read the scheme, it's very clear what they're there to protect, which is the Israeli regime and not the Palestinian people. So that doesn't mean that we don't continue to push for protection for Palestinians in Gaza. The Palestinians living in Gaza, including the political factions, the resistance groups, civil society, Pingo, and others have made it very clear what they will and will not allow. They will not legitimize this colonial grab on behalf of the Israeli regime and the Americans, but they have said that they would like to see UN protection force operating with an explicit mandate, and we can repeat it here, to do things like protect civilians, ensure the distribution of humanitarian aid, preserve evidence of Israeli crimes in Gaza, and assist the beginning of the reconstruction process there as a UN force. Remember, this 2803 thing is not a UN force. It's a UN blessing for an external, unconstrained colonial force. These are not blue helmets, these are not peacekeepers, and it's not a protection force, by any means. So no country should participate in this. It is going to bring more and more suffering, the erosion of Palestinian rights, and it will come apart. I mean, I have no doubt that the Trump administration will do whatever they have to do to try to seize control. And if that means mobilizing the mercenaries that used to call themselves the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who are still in the region lining up for jobs with this new colonial grab, if that means mobilizing CIA and special forces and others, if that means also getting just some symbolic presence of a few other troops here and there, I think they will try to do so. I don't think they will succeed. I think this thing is a plan that failure is inevitable, but it can cause a lot of harm before it does. And I think people who care about the rights of the Palestinians in Gaza and throughout Palestine have to be ready for the alternative that makes sense, which is something, look at any other situation in the wake of genocide. What is the mobilization of the international community? It's accountability for the perpetrators, redress for the victims, protection for the survivors, and then you move on into a new dispensation, not protecting the genocidal dispensation and continuing the oppression of the survivors. That cannot be something that a state, and as I've argued and as Noura has said, this is an illegal dispensation. It is an illegal resolution. And the project is unlawful. And we have to continue to make that case to discredit it and ultimately to push for states. And I agree with Noura. Change will not come from states. I was going to say above. They're not above. They're down here in the mud. We are above. Change will come from the people. They will do what we compel them to do. Or they will continue the sort of crimes that we've been witnessing. Governments and international institutions have abandoned the Palestinian people. But the people of the world are aligned with the Palestinian people overwhelmingly in this country, across the West, in the global South, across Western Asia. That's how we know our governments don't represent us. And we have to use the power that we have in order to press them to do what needs to be done and not to participate in this nonsense.
I just want to underscore that the logic here that we should keep in mind, 2803, we just have to do everything in our power to delegitimize 2803. And any kind of participation rehabilitates it, even if it means, a better, like Indonesians are better than the Germans in the ISF. That's not the logic that should drive us. How do we delegitimize it, make it weaker, and isolate the United States, right, as being criminal here?
Thank you. So you've talked extensively about international law and Israel attempting to either create new laws or claim exceptions. My question is, and I guess it's the cynic in me, does it really matter? Because realistically speaking, is any Israeli, forgetting about the Western, the co-conspirators in the civilized West, is any Israeli ever really going to face criminal prosecution? Are they really going to stand trial physically in front of a court without the U.S. permitting it? I mean, neither the ICC nor the ICJ have any authority, like enforcement authority, right? Like they rely on the cooperation of the member states. But if the member states are the ones protecting Israelis, are they ever really going to face prosecution, punishment, whatever?
So here's the thing. We never thought that the ICC was ever going to issue arrest warrants for Israelis. Like, that was an impossibility. But do you know what made it possible? The upheaval that we saw in the world, where it was now, if the ICC didn't issue the arrest warrants, it was literally it was either its legitimacy, ICC's legitimacy, or it was the ICC's existence, because they knew they were going to get attacked by the United States. And they chose legitimacy. That even if it's disemboweled, they are going to choose legitimacy. And that matters. So when we think about, will we ever see these Israelis prosecuted, it really depends on how much power we build. Literally. how much power we build, how much momentum we sustain. The fact, if we normalize anything that's happening, that is, in the response to the cynic to you, if we normalize genocide, it's dystopia. It's dystopia. That's literally what we'll get. We normalized apartheid and we got genocide. If you normalize genocide, you get dystopia. And it could start for the Palestinians, but it won't end there, right? Palestinians, in this wonderful book edited by Basma al-Ghaliani, Palestine 100+, imagines a future. All of the books in that volume are dystopian futures of how Israel, for example, controls the air and ability. The ICJ will actually probably find that it's not genocide in order to facilitate that political outcome. Law and politics are entwined. And so here's the work that we do. That's when it comes back to us. It's the tribunals. We organized an international tribunal in Gaza, but Philly organized its own international tribunal. There was just a tribunal in Canada. That's where our president of the tribunal got detained, Richard Falk, going to that tribunal.
There's 97.
And he's 90.
On his birthday.
On his birthday. There's another tribunal being organized right now across the United States, also a global tribunal. There are efforts to pursue Israeli dual nationals across the globe. That's the Hind Rajab Foundation. They are chasing them across the globe. There's an effort to do that in the United States. And even though we don't have the same law, it's similar efforts where it's to identify these dual nationals and hold them to account. When we refuse to buy products, we're also participating in accountability. When we pass resolutions in our city council that says that this is a genocide and that Palestinians deserve reparations, Zionism is racism, that is accountability. All of the accountability that we want, we must do because it's the work that we do that changes the top, not the other way around.
Noura, what's the status on all the different lawsuits that have been put against the Biden administration, for instance, and others? Is there anything that's moving forward?
Well, that's not over. I mean, some of those court cases that have been brought in U.S. jurisdictions, got to a certain point and then they were shut down on jurisdictional issues. But I don't think that's over. I think we are entering a phase where the use of judicial measures, just as one of many tools in the struggle, is going to increase. I think the way that the administration here is acting and the Israelis are acting reveals something, that they are afraid that something has broken for the first time in 80 years, that there is this huge crack in the wall of Israeli impunity that has been built up decade after decade with billions upon billions of US tax dollars and investments from across the West. And yet college students on campuses and encampments, and people marching in capitals around the world, and people in strikes and activism within their labor unions and so on, that has caused a tear in the wall of impunity that is changing history now as we speak. And that tear is allowing, and this goes to your question as well, is allowing us to finally make the kind of progress we need in the battle for legitimacy. You know, this is also a battle of legitimacy, and the law can be a tool in all of that. And, you know, I just want to say, that's how impunity works. The more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. So if you look at Israel, you see that, you know, and what's the ultimate end of that? Genocide is not a red line. If genocide is not a red line, nothing is a red line. And so you see Israel granted absolute impunity, guaranteed by the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, too many governments of the region itself, perpetrates genocide, unlawfully occupies territory in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, carries out acts of aggression against Lebanon and Syria and Iran and Iraq and Yemen, bombs humanitarian ships in the Mediterranean Sea, attacks and pirates humanitarian flotillas, carries out assassinations across the region, carries out a transnational terrorism attack in Lebanon and Syria with booby-trapped pagers in blatant violation of international law, organizes proxy groups across the West, including right here in the U.S., to harass Americans and others who are standing up to oppose genocide. Because of the impunity, that encourages more and more outrageous action until genocide itself is not a red line. And, you know, on this point of it coming home, this is a guarantee. You know, the kind of violence we see being perpetrated by the U.S. government, not that the U.S. government needed any encouragement historically to perpetrate violence at home or abroad, but we're living in a moment now where that, you know, Aimé Césaire's quote that, you know, in his discourse on colonialism, that colonialism applied at home is fascism. So if we see fascism emerging here, we should not be surprised when we are underwriting colonialism, which is exported fascism in places like Palestine. And that's why it's so important that we use all the tools we have, that we don't leave anything on the field, including international law, including court cases, including boycott and divestment and sanctions and embargoes and every tool that we have, strikes and you know, union action and so on, because even if you didn't give a damn about human rights, even if you don't give a damn about the Palestinian people, you need to know that that's the way impunity works, and wherever you are, that the next knock on the door can be on your door if we don't deploy everything we have to stop this. And, you know, it's now or never, I think. That's the moment in history in which we find ourselves.
I want to add just to the thing, like, when the genocide decision came down on January 26, 2024, people were really disappointed that it wasn't like a call for the cessation of immediate hostilities. But the most, even if they did do that, Israel could have violated it and the U.S. could have supported them. Like, that wasn't the line why genocide didn't stop. The most that we were going to get out of that ruling was what we do with it elsewhere. And so that's when we see Colombia, for example, impose its coal boycott. It stopped transferring coal. That's when we see the Japanese businesses stop transporting certain weapons. That's where we saw diplomatic relations being cut off. We're using it as a tool in order to agitate for the outcomes that we want. Right now, Ireland, Spain, and the Netherlands vowed to boycott Eurovision if they allowed Israel to participate. That's because their base is insisting that there must be accountability. We also know that there's a boycott against the New York Times by many of its writers, including myself, right? Like, to delegitimize those institutions. This is the work. I want to read to you just a few more things. Elbit Systems had to close 2 of its factories down because of boycott that we did and because of the work of Palestine Action. And then finally, just to the point, we should use the law to mobilize. And even if, like in the case against Biden, Blinken, and Austin, right, the lawsuit filed by CCR, that was dismissed at the Second Circuit level, and there's been no appeal. But the reason that that's so important is because the law, the content of it, can be used to delegitimize the ideology. Think about apartheid. It was condemned as a crime against humanity in 1973 in its own treaty. But Nelson Mandela wasn't elected until 94. Between 73 and 94, we're talking about 2 decades, not a single lawsuit was filed. It's not because of those, it's because, though, the ideology itself was marginalized. And so again here, we have that opportunity. Last year was the first lawsuits that were filed against anyone under the Apartheid Convention. So we have the opportunity to delegitimize, mobilize, and make it politically costly. Zohran Mamdani made it clear that he was going to win because he believes in Palestinian liberation and, doesn't support Israel. Make it politically costly. There's an entire movement not to take money from AIPAC. I don't know, but when I was coming up, that would have sounded nuts to me if somebody told me that, right? We make the impossible practical, not just possible, practical. And that's the work that we do in continuing to, even this discussion that Craig and I are having about 2803. The worst thing that can happen is everybody trying to put the genie back in the bottle. So even this right here is about accountability, right? It's that discourse. It's what you say to somebody around you. It's how you understand it. And it's that delegitimization.
I also think we should make just one comment, not as a legal scholar, but there is some value to, maybe I'll get in trouble, but to making it personally costly. Like that person should be, okay, good. And if I do, you can represent me in court. But really, they are, the Zionists are such professional harassers and doxers. And we, of course, we don't want to be like them. And I'm not worried about us wishing rape on people and doing all those heinous things that they do. So there's no risk of that. But there are certain things that we should do, and we should make these things a moral red line, and we should have it so that parents, the children of adults, I don't mean little kids. I mean, we want to use the fact that the young people in this country know that this is an abomination. They should be embarrassed by their parents. We need to make sure that these people are hounded wherever they go. So.
I know a lot of us in this room are activists, probably all of us in the room are activists and are more familiar with keeping public officials and public institutions accountable. But what I'm hearing from you and from other experts in the field, noting the privatization of the genocide and potential privatization of international troops in the next phase, such as having mercenaries in the event that other countries don't want to send their own troops in for optics and political reasons. So for us grassroots who are trying to hold power players accountable, how does that shift to the privatization affect accountability? How do we shift to hold private institutions accountable as it seems it's trending in that direction?
Here's the short answer. You start it and the lawyers will follow you. So there's 2 cases I'll tell you about. Royal Dutch Petroleum in Nigeria, where they were basically Shell Oil basically asked the Nigerian government to have paramilitary troops protect their pipeline so that they can extract in contravention of the rights of Nigerians, right? And these were massacres of local protesters against that extraction. Well, just recently, CCR, it took decades, but Shell had to pay out a settlement as a response. But that's because there was a movement on the ground to support them. Same thing with Elbit Systems. That targeting of Elbit and their lines gives an opportunity to the lawyers now to go after Elbit. Or if you want to go after, for example, Khaki Systems, which was involved in the torture. Khaki also lost its lawsuit, right, by CCR as they were hounding them. The point is here is if you identify your target and have a campaign, and here I would follow the Palestinian Youth Movement, which has been doing incredible work of doing the research, to follow the shipment of weapons, to follow cargo lines, right? They have influenced governments because it's embarrassing for them. Do that work and then ask, because there's law that actually holds the private actors to account as well. But the lawyers will follow the lead of the political activists. in order to enhance the campaign that you're taking on?
Yeah, I just add a tail on that, there's so many firsts in this genocide. This is the first high-tech genocide, the first live stream genocide. It's also the first globalized genocide. The complicity net of this genocide spreads right across the world, and certainly across this country as well. And yes, it includes governments like the US and Canada and the UK and Germany and others, but it also includes so many private corporations, not just those that Noura is referring to here, but a whole range of corporations that make it possible for the Israeli regime to continue to function, to even exist. Corporations represented in this neighborhood, everything from the places where you buy your coffee to the places where you get your software or your printer or whatever the case may be. They have to be made to feel a cost that's greater than the profit that they're making by participating in occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And the way that can happen, yes, that there can be legal cases against them. The Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, shout out. One of her terrific reports was a report on corporate complicity in the genocide that lists a number of corporations that should be targeted by all of us for legal action, for political action, for boycott. All of these. These are contributors to participants in the crimes that are being perpetrated by the Israeli regime. Couldn't continue without all of them. So holding these private actors accountable, absolutely. And I would just endorse also what Katie said, because there is a part of that complicity net is this network of Israeli proxy groups that have been seeded all across our countries as well, that act as, that are the ones that are persecuting ICC judges, that are persecuting politicians who dare to speak out, that are persecuting human rights defenders and peace activists, and of course, beginning with the students. We have to turn the table and hold those private actors accountable with the force of law, but also with political action, and also with where we spend our money and what we participate in. It always does come back, at least in significant measure, to BDS. We have to boycott and hold these perpetrators accountable, even as we work to hold accountable the soldiers that are firing the guns and the politicians that are giving them the orders. So yeah, a great question about not just leaving this to public institutions. These private actors also have to be held accountable.
All right, over here.
Hi, my question is specifically about War Crimes Tribunal for the war crimes committed in Gaza. So I'm wondering what you think about using a hybrid international model, like was done with the Special Court of Sierra Leone or the Special Court of Ukraine. As we know, in the Ukraine situation, Russia is in the P5 Security Council, and so obviously there's a veto there. And so they went around, and what they ended up doing, they were going to do it through the UNGA, but it ended up going through the Council of Europe and a treaty with Ukraine. And I know there might be issues with Palestine because they're not technically a recognized state, but I don't know specifically if they have the power to enter into treaties. But is there a possibility of getting the Hague 9, like a coalition of states around the world to sign a multilateral agreement to have a war crimes tribunal that, and then what the Ukraine tribunal established was an absentia jurisdiction over the defendants, which I think is a big step in criminal international law. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on a movement towards that, which would create an exclusionary zone for these Israeli war criminals throughout the world.
I think that's a great idea. I think that, you hint towards why there's not going to be a mixed tribunal or any kind of special tribunal because of the U.S. veto power that would undermine it. So I don't think that's where we're going to see the source. But is it possible, for example, to mobilize the Hague group, which is comprised of some 13 states to do it? Yeah. Then you would, contact the folks at Progressive International and, ask them if they want to coordinate that campaign. The thing about any kind of idea, a lot of us have ideas. Ideas require commitment and some sort of combustible force to get it off the ground. So of the ideas, is this the one that gets the most support because if they do that, if Progressive International does that, they're not going to do a lot of other projects. So I think the idea is fantastic, but then it becomes about, engaging with them. Are there people? Have you mobilized? For example, are there other groups in those 13 countries? Have you identified the constituents that you can go to Progressive International and say, look, We have the seed for a movement to pressure these countries. That the work starts in that way. And if we don't want to do that work on that international level, you can do what the students across the UC system did. They did a tribunal of their UC system, right? They didn't do a tribunal of the Israelis and the Americans. They did a tribunal of the system, of the board of trustees, of the president, of the folks, of the endowment that's complicit in Israeli funding. So anywhere you are, you can do the work. There's really no excuse. The work that we did around the Gaza tribunal was in the tradition of popular tribunals, where imperial powers don't normally get prosecuted because of this veto power. But the reason that it matters is that because you're creating an archive, you're mobilizing the base, you're allowing survivors to testify, you're collecting expert testimony, you're creating the legal grounds for others to pick up. It might be something to strengthen the international cases. So all of this energy is worthwhile. I think that that's possible. But I think it's not whether or not it's possible. The question is it's going to come at the exclusion of other ideas. So is that what's going to get the most support?
Yeah, I actually think there's something to be said for the whack-a-mole strategy. You see what's being invested by the US and other complicit Western regimes in trying to stop judicial action against Israeli perpetrators. And, by the way, the ICC has not given up its case against Israeli perpetrators. And there are other indictments that have been drafted against other Israeli perpetrators in addition to Netanyahu and Gallant. And that's when the US mobilized and imposed unlawfully sanctions on the ICC. Has been obstructing justice there, but they have not given up that case. And this is where the international community mobilizing to create the kind of pressure necessary to get the Europeans, for example, to deploy their blocking statutes, to block the sanctions against the prosecutor and against the judges of the ICC, and public pressure to push the ICC, and they do respond to public pressure, to push the ICC to move forward, even as we do the same thing with the International Court of Justice on the genocide case against the Israelis. They were under tremendous pressure, and yet they issued several rounds of provisional measures against the Israelis. And yet they issued a historic advisory opinion saying that Israel was practicing apartheid and racial segregation, that the occupation is entirely lawful, it has to end altogether, and so on. Despite that pressure, because they also feel the pressure from the global public to do the right thing. They have their own legacy in mind, and the legacy of those courts. And yes, you can imagine a dedicated tribunal being set up. We have said there's no way let's just make it very simple. Anything that comes out of the UN Security Council will be bad for Palestine. Because if the US initiates it or allows it to pass, it will be bad for Palestine. That is the role that the US plays in the UN and especially in the Security Council. So that means those solutions have to come outside the Security Council. The UN General Assembly, under Uniting for Peace, could establish a kind of accountability mechanism, even a tribunal. It wouldn't have the power to enforce compliance with the tribunal, but it could do the trials and the hearings and the testimony and the documents and the archives and contribute to the historical record and the building of the global call for accountability for the Israeli regime. And I think that is very much worth doing, even as a final legal measure. We also pursue accountability for individual perpetrators in third-party courts. And yes, Mamdani should arrest Netanyahu, and he should make it clear he's going to do so until the world for Netanyahu gets so small that he can't go anywhere except in the rooms of his house until we finally get our hands on him.
I mean, I feel like there's a thirst, like folks are like, okay, we know all that, but what are the lawyers doing? I knew it. Okay. The lawyers are doing a lot. All right. Let me just tell you that there are efforts globally where the lawyers are doing a lot across Europe, especially. Look up if you want. I told you the Hind Rajab Foundation, but also the European Legal Support Center. In Australia, there's a Palestine Justice Center run by Rawan Arraf, who's the cousin of our beloved Huwaida, right? There's also lawyers that are suing, for example, the Dutch government in order not to sell the spare parts for F-35 jets. Al-Haq is partnering with lawyers in the UK also to sue the British government not to sell parts. There are lawsuits in Italy trying to do the same. In the United States right now, there are FOIA requests in order to demonstrate whether or not there was collusion between the U.S. government and private actors that would have deprived Palestinians of their civil liberties in violation of Section 1985, one of the major violations of civil rights and human rights. There are other efforts to sue different organizations that are perpetuating the impunity in the United States in order to have them either register as foreign agents because they're working on behalf of Israel but benefiting from C3 status, or because alleging that they're defrauding the government. So let me let you know that the whack-a-mole is on fire. And the lawyers are doing, this is the thing, we want this big solution. But there are political impediments to that big thing. Like the ICJ and the ICC is as good as it's gonna get, all right? And that's government-led. The solutions that you're not seeing, the law has to be precise. So it's looking after the details, the commas, the document reviews, that it's going to find the holes. And that's why you're probably not hearing about it, because it's so detailed and boring. But it's happening. But it's happening.
All right, I want to be respectful. I want to be respectful of your time. I wanted to give Sam Husseini and Ronnie Khalaq the last words, if that's okay. We'll have them ask
But
the two last questions.
Did you
the
define
journalists.
did you define or explain Uniting for Peace? So you referred to it. So after Sam's question, then maybe you want to just say what that is. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, dovetails with my question. Obviously, I honestly, I'm always the stinky pig at the party or something here. I honestly found this. I learned a lot, but I kind of found this unfocused. And I think, in part, we need to fess up to our failures, because we have failed, and Craig has said outright we failed. So we need to fess up to our failures so that we can better figure out how to save lives in Palestine and some semblance of international order. So I think one huge failure was that the Trump thing didn't come out of the blue. It had a very clear precedent, and that was just after the last ICJ order of May 24th, 2024, that said, you, Israel, must stop your invasion of Rafah that started on May 7th. That was a clear order from the ICJ. The prior two orders, weren't as direct. The Algerians said that they were drafting a resolution to implement that, which would have a properly functioning Security Council acting as sheriff to the court would have done. The U.S. stalled for time, and then Biden gets up there and says, we have a ceasefire. Netanyahu has agreed to a ceasefire. And I'm sorry to say, most of the peace movement peed in their pants and said, hooray, hooray, we have a ceasefire. That's what we want. No, a ceasefire is not what we want. We collectively have to keep our eye on the ball. At that point, what we wanted was a implementation of the court orders. So I think that if we're going to be smart legal guerrillas, there needs to be leadership on these issues so that movements know how to assert themselves at the right time. And so they passed a resolution on June 10th, 2024 that said that blessed the U.S. negotiating process, an Oslo process that Albanese and Hamas both welcomed. Insane. It totally ignored the ICJ orders. Algeria voted for it. Everybody voted for it except the Russians, who abstained. They didn't veto it. They called it out. They said this is bullshit, and they were completely right, but they didn't veto it. The Algerians supported it, Albanese supported it, even Hamas supported it. It was insane, and it laid the groundwork for continuing the genocide. So I think the peace movement needs to take its lumps in it, and we need to be able to use international law in a skillful manner as a, what we did.
And then do you have a question? Because I did.
Yeah, like nobody else has commented. It's like being a guerrilla. Yeah. Yalla. Yeah, I'm sorry to lay out the facts, but they must be laid out. The next step in the process, we made some mention of Uniting for Peace, but we have made no mention of the fact that Colombia said that they would do it, which a lot of us were excited about before Trump came along and, did what he did. What are the prospects for that? If this thing falls apart, as you, Craig, say that it will, how can we move on that? And I got a flyer on Uniting for Peace that I'm happy to pass out for people who actually want to, have a strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And thanks for always keeping us on our toes. I think that is very important. Yeah, the Uniting for Peace movement has had some real disappointments. So Katie asked, what is Uniting for Peace? Uniting for Peace is a mechanism in the UN General Assembly that allows the General Assembly to get around a Security Council veto, usually by the US, and to take action with a 2/3 majority of member states. Everyone gets one vote, no veto. It's a possibility for the UN to do something, even when the Americans don't want us to do something. So, and this is a mechanism that was established during the Cold War, in fact, during the Korea conflict, and which has been used in the past to even deploy UN forces to the Sinai at the height of the Suez crisis. And so activists around the world have been saying, we want a Uniting for Peace resolution to mandate a protection force for the Palestinian people, beginning in Gaza, and to do those other things that I talked about, adopt accountability measures to hold Israel accountable. And there was, people got very excited by the fact that we managed to get a state sponsor in Colombia. President Gustavo Petro came to the UN, announced that he wanted the UN to do this kind of thing, made a speech outside the UN, supporting the activists who were involved in this movement, and then immediately he was attacked by the Trump administration for doing so. They tried to make up some story, he was telling US troops that they shouldn't implement superior orders. Seems to be a theme lately, by the way. Shouldn't implement superior orders, and that's why we are sanctioning him. But in fact, it was the Trump administration attacking him for daring to propose an avenue that might actually work in the General Assembly. Well, as that was happening, Israel's friends were not asleep. They were moving on the French-Saudi plan. They were moving on the Trump plan. And those things took the wind out of the sails of the political effort to try to get this done for Palestine in the General Assembly. It doesn't mean it's dead. As I said earlier, the Trump plan, one way or another, is going to fall apart. And we also don't have to wait for it to fall apart. We need to continue to push member states, yes, beginning with the Hague Group, but more broadly, states that have voted in favor of Palestinian rights consistently to move. Begin by moving, where's the protection for the West Bank, by the way? There's no stabilization force there. Where are the accountability measures for the Israeli regime? And how can we start building the possibility of protection for Palestinians in Gaza as well? There has to be some answer when all of this falls apart. And so that's why, working to dismantle this horrific 2803 nightmare and then to put in its place is something that has a hope of actually changing the situation on the ground. I think that's where it's very important. And Uniting for Peace, yes, can still be a part of that, absolutely.
I think we're ready. Oh, we do have a question. All right, change your mind.
I just wanted to thank my comrades on stage. You all have been fantastic. Really just wonderful. I learned so much from all three of you, and I appreciate all of the work that you all do, especially Noura and Craig in the legal field. And I wanted to ask you, and the reason I said my question was answered is because Craig can read my mind, I guess, because I was actually thinking about the war coming home. And you were talking about the war coming home, and I saw over the week there was this conference that was held by Israel Hayom, this Adelson-funded pro-Likud Israeli newspaper, but like everyone from across the political spectrum was there, including Hillary Clinton. You guys probably saw her disgusting clips go viral, but also, yeah, shame on her. But also the CEO of the Israeli American Council. And he made this really scary comment that I think speaks to the moment that we're in about using the tactics Israel has used against their enemies in the region, where they feel they've defeated all their enemies, even if they haven't, against those outside of the region, meaning specifically here in the US. And when I see what's happened over the last couple of years, but specifically, since the Trump administration came into power, where it's really been ratcheted up, this campaign against the population here. But it started through, suppressing Palestine activism. I mean, the first people ICE arrested were students who, on student visas who spoke out for Palestine. And so you have the Zionists really like collaborating with fascistic forces in this country right now to come after our rights, specifically our right to protest, our First Amendment rights. And, as obviously what's been happening in Gaza is so scary, but as you guys often say, what happens there doesn't stay there. So I was just wondering if maybe a good topic to end on would speak to how frightening this moment is in terms of the attack on the law coming here, in the U.S.
So I'm just going to echo, and I'm going to plug, actually, since I've been plugging writings, I have an essay in the Boston Review on the Imperial Boomerang coming home. And there I'm not only emphasizing, pulling on Amy Césaire on how, fascism is colonialism is at home, but also that, Césaire's point was that the European genocide was perfected in the colonial geographies. So by the time it's meted out by Hitler, it had been done by the Germans against the Naman Herero people and by, the Belgians against the Congolese people, right? And then it's coming home. And so in the same way, there is no way to protect ourselves from that boomerang coming back, right? And this imperial violence coming here, which we see it. It's fascism, right? We see that. Now, the reason that the Palestine question is so important is because Palestinians are always used as the guinea pigs for state repression, right? So the first person where you see secret evidence introduced in court in violation of, civil procedure is against Palestinians, right? Or when we see it used against Sami al-Aryan, who can't protest and doesn't even know the charges against him. Or when we see it used against the Holy Land Foundation when they can't cross-examine the witness who's testifying against them, right? Or when we see it used against Rasmiya Odeh to denaturalize her, right? Or Stephen Salaita, the first tenured professor to lose his tenure. We are the guinea pigs for state repression. And the reason that we're that guinea pig is because of the thorough dehumanization of Palestinians, where the same things that if they were said about any other group, dirty Arabs, dirty Muslims, right? Terrorists, they're violent, right? Think of all the worst things if they were said about any other group would cause an uproar. But when they're said about us, it's like, why don't you debate it? Free speech, everybody should debate that, right? That's when free speech applies. But that's the thorough dehumanization. And we're seeing it right now, just if we're paying attention to that specific tactic, because Zionism is in its final throes, that's the tactic that they're using right now, which is to ratchet up this Islamophobia that Melanie Phillips captured, which was to say that if you don't kill all those Palestinians over there, the Muslims are going to come over here. Look at that racialized thing that she's doing, right? Muslims are Palestinians. They're all part of some sort of network. They're going to take over. And this Texas candidate, Valentina Tizi, what was it? Yeah. But who's like, out there spewing, but they're all, this is what we also know, that when we do that work, we're also pushing back against that dehumanization and therefore against those state repression tactics here. This is really big, but it means we all have the opportunity to do that work, whether it be on our campuses, be in our communities, it be in the media that we create, be the exposure, and so on and so forth, and frankly, the shaming. It should be really impossible for anybody to be saying these things on the air. It should be really impossible.
Yeah, I mean, only to agree. I mean, what it all comes down to is that this ideology of Zionism is a deeply racist and fundamentally violent ideology. And that's the way it appears in Palestine, and that's the way it appears here as well. And, it sounds like just a slogan that it's all one struggle, but it really is all one struggle. And that struggle really has come home here in horrific ways. You see it in the, the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was, explicitly developed in order to blur the distinctions between anti-Semitism and human rights defense effectively. And then the criminalization of breaches of that edict. You see it in firings, you see it in expulsions from university, you see it in the deportations, you see it in the dismantling of rights one after another in this country on behalf of an oppressive foreign regime. Imagine, the First Amendment of the Constitution, which the U.S. loves to hold up in its international conversations as a great champion of free speech, is being systematically dismantled in the U.S. on behalf of an oppressive foreign regime, because there are actors in this country who are thoroughly dedicated to persecuting human rights defenders, those who defend the rights of the Palestinian people, on behalf of this ideology. That's why it really is so dangerous, because it's not just all these nutjob groups out there who are pretending to be battling anti-Semitism, but really are just advancing bigotry in its most vile form. It's the fact that institutions of the state are collaborating with them. They're the ones who are asking law enforcement and political authorities to persecute people on behalf of the Israeli regime. They're the ones who are not just doxing, but mobilizing in order to have these human rights violations be perpetrated against us. They cannot be allowed to operate in the shadows anymore. We have to confront them directly. We have to expose them. We have to use whatever tools we have available to counter this very violent and racist movement that is functioning in genocidal ways in Palestine and is functioning in oppressive ways right here in the U.S. It really is all one struggle.
I think everyone would agree this was probably one of the most informative, deep conversations that we've had, and I feel more hopeful knowing that we are in such great hands and such smart people that are doing this kind of work. Thank you so much, Frank Mokhiber. Thank you so much, Noura Erakat. And thank you so much, Katie Halper, for helping us to make this conversation so rich. Thank you all for being here.